mental disease with delusions of fame, grandeur, persecution.
To episode 62 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are attending two family reunions, at which the return of prodigal children exposes secrets, lies, madness, and murder. First up, we have Paranoiac with ! From Hammer Studios in 1963. This was directed by Freddie Francis and stars Janette Scott, Oliver Reed, Alexander Davion, and Sheila Burrell. Then we follow this with A Return to Spain and A Bell from Hell from 1973. This was directed by Claudio Guerín Hill and stars Renaud Verley, Christina von Blanc, Viveca Lindfors, Maribel Martín, and Nuria Gimeno. Along the way, we'll be discussing Hammer's move from horror into the world of the psychological thriller, the attempted fraud which loosely inspired Paranoiac, the career of director and cinematographer Freddie Francis, why there's no such thing as a cursed movie, and much, much more. But before we go any further, just a quick heads up that there isn't going to be an episode next week. I'm going to be taking a week off, and I'm also going to be at Fright Fest in London, hopefully watching some new films that will find their way into this podcast in the future. But I will be back on the 6th of September with a return to the giallo and the psycho killer subgenres, more on which at the end of the show. And also a bit of an apology to anyone who watches along with the podcast. At the end of last week's episode, I forgot to mention that A Bell from Hell has a truly horrible sequence near the start, with, once again, scenes shot in a real slaughterhouse, which go on for ages. I meant to give a warning, and I completely forgot, so anyone who saw that unprepared, I can only apologise. And for anyone who hasn't seen it yet, consider yourself warned. There do tend to be quite a few slaughterhouses in Spanish horror movies of the 70s for some reason, not entirely sure why, but as a general rule, it is an idea to sometimes go in with that in mind. And so, with that being said, back to our usual programming. And as always, just before we begin, I'd like to mention the key sources that I've used in preparing this week's episode, and all sources used will be listed or linked in the show notes. So, when discussing Paranoiac, I have referenced the books, Hammer Films, An Exhaustive Filmography by Tom Johnson and Deborah Del Vecchio, and the films of Oliver Reed by Susan D. Cowie and Tom Johnson. I have also referred to interviews and articles on the websites historyproject.org.uk, bloodydisgusting.com, and horrorcultfilms.co.uk. And I've also referred to interviews, commentaries, and special features on the Blu-ray release of the film from Final Cut Entertainment. And when talking about A Bell from Hell, I have referenced interviews and special features on the Blu-ray release of the film from Severin Films, and interviews and articles on the websites cinemax.es, criticalia.com, and lpay.com. I have also referenced the book Sex, Sadism, Spain and Cinema by Nicholas G. Schlegel. And we are getting into our first film straight away this week, which, as you've heard, is Paranoiac from 1963. This Hammer production was directed by Freddie Francis, written by Jimmy Sangster, and stars Janette Scott, Oliver Reed, Alexander Davion, and Sheila Burrell. Hammer films are now, of course, best known for their colour gothic horrors, initiated by The Curse of Frankenstein in 1957. But across the late 1950s and early 1960s, they also released a string of rather uneven black and white psychological thrillers, some excellent and some not quite so much. These were inspired at first by the success of Henri-Georges Clouzot's 1955 film Les Diaboliques, and I suppose they technically begin with a film called The Snorkel, which was released in 1958. This opens with an intriguing sequence of a man gassing his wife to death in their Italian villa, sealing her in their bedroom so that it's airtight, and then hiding himself under the floorboards, where he survives by using diving apparatus, hence the snorkel of the title. Sadly, from this promising beginning, the film descends into a fairly pedestrian narrative, and was described at the time as being not very distinguished, but still managing to be more absorbing than the average low-budget film, which is damning by faint praise, if ever I've heard it. But it was really following the success of Psycho in 1960 that Hammer put their foot on the accelerator, releasing several psychological thrillers that the studio's co-founder, James Carreras, dubbed mini Hitchcocks, but which were perhaps more accurately described by writer Jonathan Rigby when he called them mini Clouseaus. The first of this second wave was A Taste of Fear in 1961, which was released in the US under the, in my opinion, far less evocative title of Scream of Fear. Considered by many to be the best of the series, this features American actress Susan Strasberg, the daughter of renowned acting coach Lee, as a wheelchair-bound heroine who visits her father at his home in France, only to find him mysteriously missing, and her stepmother and a local doctor, played by Christopher Lee, acting equally mysteriously. The screenplay was written by Jimmy Sangster, who we discussed in episode 51 when we covered his screenwriting debut, X the Unknown. By the time of Taste of Fear, Sangster had already written these screenplays for The Curse of Frankenstein, Dracula, The Brides of Dracula, and The Mummy, to name but a few, and growing tired of the Gothic, was looking to branch out in a new direction. In an interview given in 2006, he remembered seeing Les Diaboliques and Psycho in the same week at the cinema, and on viewing them said to himself that writing screenplays in the same vein looked like a lot of fun, and that it was something he felt he could do. He followed Taste of Fear with Maniac, again set in France and again produced by Hammer. This stars Donald Houston as a blowtorch-wielding escapee from an insane asylum, and on its 1963 release was described by Time magazine as good, clean sadism. The New York Times was slightly less complimentary, admiring the cunning plot and twitching suspense, but saying that it was rather undeveloped and that it felt more like, quote, a striking blueprint with satanic tentacles for a much better picture, end quote. In my opinion, that better picture was the first of this week's movies, Paranoiac, also released in 1963 and once again written by Sangster. But although it hit the screen in the early 1960s, the property had been in discussion at Hammer as early as 1954, when they acquired the rights to the source material. And this was a novel called Brat Farrar by a Scottish author called Elizabeth Mackintosh, who wrote under the pen name Josephine Tay. Tay wrote and published her novel in 1949, but its thematic origins date back much, much further, as she took as part of her inspiration a notorious fraud case from the 1870s, which both fascinated and divided Victorian society at the time. Being completely honest, I could probably talk about Paranoiac quite comfortably without getting into this historic case at all, but the story is fascinating, if not completely bonkers, and rather tragic. And so I'm going to ask you to indulge me more than a little and come with me as I dive down the rabbit hole surrounding it for just a few moments and discuss what is now known as the case of the Tichborne claimant. And just as a heads up, this is going to contain significant spoilers for both the novel and the storyline of Paranoiac. So, as always, please approach with all due care and attention from this point onwards. The Tichborne family were an old English Catholic family whose roots in Hampshire, England, were said to date back to before the Norman conquest of the 11th century. At the start of our story, the family was headed by a man called Sir Edward Doughty, the 9th Baronet, who owned Tichborne Park in Hampshire. Sir Edward had no surviving male children, and so, as was the way in those days, Once Sir Edward died, the title and family estates were due to pass to his younger brother James. James was married to a woman called Henriette Félicité Seymour, who had been raised in France and was reportedly descended from the French royal family. But the marriage was not a very happy one, and the couple spent much time apart, with James living in England and Henriette in Paris, where she raised their eldest son Roger, who had been born in 1829. In 1845, Roger, who had been raised speaking predominantly French and who spoke English with a very heavy French accent, returned to England to complete his education. And after this, he joined the military, where he served for 3 years, mainly in Ireland. During his leave, Roger regularly stayed at Tichborne Park with his uncle Edward, his aunt, and their daughter Catherine, who was 4 years his junior. Rather unfortunately, Roger and Catherine fell in love, and fearing the disapproval of their families, the two began to meet in secret. Eventually, though, this was discovered, and their relationship was forbidden, as their families, perhaps understandably, were not exactly thrilled at the prospect of two first cousins marrying. Frustrated and rather broken-hearted, Roger resigned his military position and in 1853 left England for South America. When he arrived in Chile that June, he learned that Sir Edward had died and that the Tichborne title and estates had passed on to his father, who was now Sir James Tichborne, the 10th Baronet. Despite the news, Roger continued his travels, securing a berth on a ship called the Bella, which capsized and was wrecked in 1854, with all hands, including Roger, presumably lost at sea. In 1862, Sir James died, meaning that if Roger had survived, he would have become the heir to the estates. But, as he was presumed deceased, the title and the land went to his younger brother Alfred, who burned through the family fortune and nearly lost them everything. One person, though, did not believe that Roger was dead, and this was his mother Henriette, who, encouraged by a clairvoyant, became convinced that her son was alive and began to place newspaper adverts offering a reward for information as to his whereabouts. And these adverts were published first in London and then later in the British colonies, including in Australia. And so, in 1865, a man going by the name of Thomas Castro appeared in Australia, claiming to be the missing Roger, saying that he had survived the shipwreck, and that, for some reason best known to himself, he had been living under an assumed name. He wrote to Lady Tichborne, who was immediately convinced of the letter's authenticity, despite the fact that it was written in uneducated language and rather poor handwriting. I think it's probably safe to assume that her mind was clouded by grief. She had not only lost her son Roger and her husband just a few years before, but her younger son Alfred had also died, and so it's rather understandable that she clung to this glimmer of hope perhaps a little bit too hard. And so she welcomed him with open arms, paying little to no attention to the various red flags that were dotted across his story. Firstly, he was now working as a butcher in Wagga Wagga, Australia, and was married to an illiterate former housemaid with whom he had a baby. He also bore little physical resemblance to her educated and bilingual son. Before leaving on his travels, Roger had been described as a man of slender build, with a long, sallow face, straight dark hair, and a tattoo on his arm. But the man who arrived from Australia was 24 stone, had a large round face, fair hair, and no trace of any tattoo at all. More to the point, he could no longer speak French and had not a trace of Roger's original heavy French accent. So I imagine he probably left those in the same place he lost his tattoo. She didn't even think it odd that, at his insistence, their first meeting was held in a darkened room because he claimed to be ill and that daylight was painful for him to experience. He also made multiple blunders describing his childhood and education, and even when talking about members of his supposed own family. But grief, I suppose, does strange things to one's judgment. Deciding that this was indeed her missing son, she immediately settled on him an allowance of £1,000 a year, which is roughly the equivalent of £150,000 today. Needless to say, the rest of the family weren't taken in at all, and when Lady Tichborne died 3 years later, they cut him off entirely. Eventually, running out of money, he bought a civil case against the family to claim the Tichborne lands, which at the time were worth £25,000, or just short of £4 million today. The trial lasted for 120 days, at the end of which the court rejected his claims. He was then charged with perjury, and a criminal trial began in 1873, lasting 188 days until February 1874. During the trial, Castro managed to bring forward 100 witnesses in his favour, many of them people who had served with Sir Roger in the military and who swore that he was in fact the real deal. Ultimately, though, the jury found against him, firstly because all of a sudden he couldn't really speak any French, and secondly because he was eventually exposed as really being a man called Arthur Orton. Orton had been brought up in Wapping, London, not the best neighbourhood in London at the time, and had travelled to Australia as a young boy. Even more significantly, once he arrived there, he was alleged to have become a member of a horse-stealing and cattle-rustling gang, and there were also rumours that he was a murderer. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the trial became a cause célèbre in England, but what is surprising is that many people sided with Orton, claiming that he was a working-class hero who had been denied his legal rights by a corrupt elite. These supporters became known as the Tichborne movement, and commemorative souvenirs, including medallions, tea towels, and china figurines, were created in his honour. But despite this public support, Orton was eventually found guilty and was sentenced to 14 years in prison. His lawyer was also disbarred for his behaviour, which had included claiming that his client was a victim of an establishment conspiracy, which had included the Catholic Church, the government, and members of the aristocracy. Strangely enough, and with no small amount of irony, after his disbarment, he became a politician and was even elected to Parliament, though once all the hubbub from the case eventually died down, he lost his seat at the next election. Like I said, absolutely bonkers. And it was this case that inspired Josephine Tey to create the basic plot of her novel Brat Farrar, which told the story of the Ashby family, who have a country estate on the south coast of England. In the novel, the family is made up of Aunt Beatrice and the 4 children of her late brother Bill. There is Simon, who is 20, Eleanor, who is 18, and then there are young twins, Jane and Ruth, who are both aged 9. Bill and his wife Nora died 8 years before the novel starts, and their oldest son Patrick, who is Simon's twin and older by just a few minutes, has also disappeared shortly after their death, leaving behind what has been taken to be a suicide note. And into this world comes our titular character, Brat Farrar, or Brat Farrar, depending on your pronunciation, an orphan who ran away to America and who has returned to England. One day in the street, he is mistaken for the missing Patrick by a man called Alec Loading, who knows the Ashby family intimately and who sees in this mysterious lookalike an opportunity to access the family fortune. And so Brat is coached in all aspects of the Ashby family history, and impersonating the missing Patrick enters into the household, where his presence becomes a significant disruption. It most certainly proves to be a disruption for Patrick's twin brother Simon, who knows that this person cannot be his brother because he himself murdered him several years before. The novel was optioned by Hammer in 1954, after which there were 2 attempts made to film the story, one in 1955 and the other in 1959. The second of these was due to star Dirk Bogarde in the lead, with the American Joseph Losey directing, but this was abandoned as the US distributors Columbia were less than keen on the proposed storyline. It was only after the success of Psycho and of Hammer's own Psycho imitation, A Taste of Fear, that the studio decided to try once again. For this adaptation, they gave screenwriting duties to Jimmy Sangster, who kept the basis of Tay's novel but made several significant changes. These included getting rid of the young twin siblings and also changing how the Ashby family maintained their wealth, which in the novel was through the sport of horse racing. In an interview he gave to the authors of the book, The Films of Oliver Reed, Sangster elaborated on his approach. Quote, "I was a fan of Josephine Tay's work, and I tried to keep as much of it as possible. That said, I didn't keep much. We didn't even put her name on the credits, for which she was probably rather grateful. Due to our limited budget, the horse racing segments of her novel, it really centred on the sport, had to go. And due to this being a Hammer film, horror had to come in. One of my favourite films is Lady Abolique, a classic of plot twists and turns. I like it so much that I've rewritten it quite a few times myself." End quote. And so, maintaining the basic structure of the imposter joining the family home, Sangster added in several plot points that were far more suited to the emerging Hammer horror style. And so we have a gothic and cobwebbed chapel, psychological game-playing, hints of incest, touches of sexual sadism, insanity, and a highly memorable masked figure wielding a billhook. He also crucially introduced an element of mystery as to the identity of the interloper. In the source material, Brat Farah is revealed as an imposter early on, but for the first half of Paranoiac, we are left to guess whether the character, now called Tony, is actually the real deal or not. His changes were so significant that Hammer considered whether or not they even needed to pay for an extension to the screen rights to Tay's novel. And though they did indeed do so, in the end, as we've already heard from Sangster, her name would be left off the final film credits. Paranoiac was the first Hammer film to be directed by Freddie Francis, a director and cinematographer who we discussed very briefly back in episode 46, when we covered his work on the 1961 movie The Innocents. He was born in London on the 22nd of December 1917 and became a fan of photography and cinema from a very young age. By the time he was 14, his uncle, who was an amateur photographer, was teaching him all that he knew about the craft, including how to process and develop his own films. And so, when, at school, he was tasked with writing a thesis on any subject of his choosing, he decided to write it about filmmaking. This led to his spending many hours in the library getting as much information as possible, but he also managed to spend some time on the set of the film Due Suisse, starring Conrad Veidt, which was filming in London at the time. And according to Francis, from that moment on, he was hooked on the profession and filmmaking became all that he wanted to do. When he left school at 16, he became an apprentice to a photographer called Louis Protheroe, where he spent much of his time assisting with stills photography for various British movies. He stayed with Protheroe for 6 months, but began to realise that this apprenticeship wasn't really getting him anywhere. Fortunately, at this time, his father made the acquaintance of a man who worked at British International Pictures, a studio which just a few years earlier had hired a young director by the name of Alfred Hitchcock. British International were looking for a clapper boy to work on their productions, and so, in 1933, Francis left Protheroe and began working there. This soon led to other opportunities with other studios, and he found himself moving from clapper boy to focus puller, generally working on low-budget and low-quality quota-quickie productions, which we've spoken of now several times in this series. In 1939, following the outbreak of World War II, he joined the army, and he was assigned to the filmmaking division, working with various units making training films for the military. This gave him experience in any number of film roles, including as a cameraman and also as an editor. After 7 years in the military, he returned to civilian life and immediately resumed working back in cinema. Within 3 weeks of being demobbed, he flew to Africa as part of the second unit for a film called The Macombra Affair, after which he began working with The Archers, the production company of Michael Powell and Emmerich Pressburger, where he worked as a camera operator and occasionally did some second unit photography. Across the 1950s, he worked with the American director John Huston, with whom he made 3 pictures: Moulin Rouge in 1952, Beat the Devil, also in 1952, and Moby Dick in 1956. He later recalled the experience as highly educational, recalling that Huston was, quote, a great one for looking through the camera and just figuring out how much he could work into the frame. He also taught me one very valuable thing. Look through the lens, say to yourself what is the intent of the shot, and if the intention doesn't read, forget it and start something else. From the point of view of a real filmmaker, I found John very exciting, purely because he knew exactly what he wanted to do. End quote. By now, Francis had a wealth of experience and had moved from camera operator to cinematographer. In 1958, he shot the multi-award-winning drama Room at the Top, and a year later, he was the cinematographer on the kitchen sink drama Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. And then, in 1960, came a personal triumph, when he won the Oscar for Best Cinematography for the D.H. Lawrence adaptation Sons and Lovers. In the same year, he worked with Hammer Studios for the very first time, photographing their incredibly dark drama Never Take Sweets from a Stranger, and he followed this in 1961 with The Innocents. We covered his photography on this film extensively back in our earlier episode, but it's certainly worth pointing out that his work here was once again praised highly. The critic Pauline Kael, in particular, singled him out in her review, writing, quote, I don't know where this cinematographer Freddie Francis sprang from, but you may recall in the last year, just about every time a British movie is something to look at, it turns out to be his. End quote. The move from cinematographer to director might seem quite a natural one, but it's not always easy, and this was certainly the case for Freddie Francis. His directorial debut was a 1962 romantic comedy called Two and Two Make Six, but it's fair to say that his direction certainly didn't receive the same acclaim that his cinematography had. He himself would later say it was one of those things that he should never have done, and the Monthly Film Bulletin wrote that, quote, Freddie Francis's direction lacks the necessary lift and confidence, and it is the cast, in fact, which enables this film to be indulgently enjoyed. End quote. His next film wasn't much more successful either. This was a British and German co-production called The Brain, released in 1962, and which was described by critics of the time as being preposterous. Francis would later say that it too was one of those films that he should have left alone, but at least his direction was singled out for a small amount of praise by the Monthly Film Bulletin, which noted that he had an eye for a startling and sinister image. He followed this with some uncredited work on the British science fiction film The Day of the Triffids, when he was brought in to film some extra scenes in a lighthouse to bolster the movie's plot and running time. Asked about this later, he was rather self-deprecating, saying, quote, we didn't make it a good film, but at least we made it acceptable to the people who were going to put the money in. End quote. So, not the most auspicious start for his directing career, and it's fair to say that as he began shooting Paranoiac in 1962, the signs weren't looking all that good. Happily, though, it would appear that all he needed was the right material, as his third official stint in the director's chair turned out to be the charm. Paranoiac is the first of Hammer's second wave of thrillers not to be set in France, like Lady Abelique, but instead in England. Filmed in CinemaScope, it opens with a beautiful shot of the sea crashing against the base of some cliffs, before panning over the seascape to reveal the Jurassic coast of Dorset. And although on Paranoiac Francis was acting as director, with cinematographer duties provided by Arthur Grant, it's certainly true that this film echoes much of Francis's photography from the 1961 film The Innocents. As well as the use of CinemaScope, the two recycled many of the techniques that Francis had used in that earlier film, particularly the creative use of lighting, depth of field, and the use of masking on the lenses to create a sense of claustrophobia. After the opening credits, our incredibly mobile camera tracks through the local churchyard, providing an almost subjective viewpoint as it pushes past some branches to reveal a tombstone. This bears the names of John and Mary Ashby, who we see died in 1950. And as the sound of a vicar giving a sermon fills our ears, the camera then glides around to the side of the tombstone, where we see another marker, this one in memory of their son Anthony, who died in 1953. The camera then arrives in the interior of the church, continuing its journey as it first closes in on the vicar before turning 180 to reveal the congregation and then settle on a middle-aged woman sitting in a church pew. This acts by means of an introduction to our key players, the Ashby family, who are introduced through the vicar's sermon as the camera picks them out one by one. Harriet Ashby, the aunt and ersatz matriarch of the household, and Eleanor Ashby sitting next to her and clearly in a rather fragile state. It is only when our next character is introduced that we switch to a different perspective, as the vicar tells us about Simon Ashby, who has played the organ in the church ever since he was a boy. And at this point, Simon is indeed introduced, not though through a close-up, but by a puff of cigarette smoke, with the fact that he is smoking in church acting as a shorthand for the nature of his character. The camera then slowly pans to the right, and we see the face of our chief antagonist, Simon, played by British actor Oliver Reed. The late Oliver Reed is now rather a legend in British cinema, noted for his performances in the 1968 musical Oliver, the 1969 D.H. Lawrence adaptation Women in Love, the 1975 rock musical Tommy, and in his final screen appearance, the Ridley Scott epic Gladiator, for which he was posthumously awarded a BAFTA. Horror fans, though, might know him best for his roles in 1961's The Curse of the Werewolf, 1971's The Devils, Burnt Offerings from 1976, and David Cronenberg's The Brood, which was released in 1979. And for those of us with slightly lesser tastes, there's also the terrible snake on the loose movie Venom from 1981. That's the one where a black mamba crawls up his trouser leg and bites him on the dick, so, like I say, it's for those of us with slightly lesser tastes. Rather tragically, he was equally as well known for his drinking and off-camera hell-raising as he was for his considerable acting talents. But his screen career did span over 40 years, and at the peak of his career, in 1971, he was voted the 5th most popular star at the British box office. Paranoiac would mark his first real starring role, but he was no stranger to Hammer Productions, having appeared in several of their previous movies. These included as a thug in a 1960 film, The Two Faces of Dr. Jekyll, the tragic Leon in 1961's The Curse of the Werewolf, and in the same year as Paranoiac, he also put in a very impressive turn in their incredibly bleak science fiction thriller, The Damned. In an interview given to the authors of Reed's filmography, Hammer executive Anthony Hines said of the actor, quote, "As the producer and writer of The Curse of the Werewolf, I knew we had something special in Oliver Reed. He was a born film star, really, and Hammer was fortunate that he stayed with us as long as he did. He had a wonderful attitude, he was cooperative, and he didn't take himself too seriously. After Paranoiac, I knew Oliver's time with us was coming to an end. He had too much talent to stay in the type of films that we could offer him. His success on an international level didn't surprise me in the least." End quote. We'll be covering The Curse of the Werewolf and some of Reed's other horrors later on in the series, so I'm not going to give you a biography of him just yet. But I will say that, like many actors of his generation, his was a considerable talent that was sadly marred by alcohol. Although at times his performance in Paranoiac does stray a little too far into the Grand Guignol, overall it is his presence that very much carries the film. And I'm certainly not the first person to mention that there is also something eerily prophetic in his casting as Simon Ashby, an alcoholic and aggressive hellraiser with a fondness for the brandy and rather drunken outbursts. His line, "I've been drinking and now I'm going to drink some more," sounds very much like something I would have heard him say in a 1980s talk show. And the assumption that Simon is going to drink himself to death eventually also feels like a case of life imitating art. If we hadn't gathered enough about Simon's character in his introductory shot, we are soon left in little doubt as to his nature when he stubs his cigarette out on the church organ. Before that, though, we are given a rather blunt exposition dump by the vicar and learn that it is the anniversary of Mary and John Ashby's death. More importantly, we also learn that their son Anthony apparently took his own life 3 years later, which, as the vicar undiplomatically reminds everybody, is a sin in the eyes of God. Well, thanks, vicar. I'm sure that really helps with everybody's grief. And just at that moment, we see a male figure appear in the church doorway, backlit by the outside world to such an extent that his face is completely in shadow. Eleanor turns, clearly seeing him, and then faints dead away. And suddenly, our mysterious man disappears. Eleanor is helped from the church, and Simon drives off uncaringly and rather frantically in his sports car, sarcastically asking Aunt Harriet if she wants a lift before he pulls away. At this point, we move to the Ashby family home, where Eleanor is being tended to by a nurse called Francois, the film's one nod to Hammer's former obsession with all things French. Eleanor tells Francois that the figure she saw in the church was her dead brother Tony, and the nurse is understandably rather incredulous, but it has to be said her response is even less diplomatic than the local vicar. She reminds her patient that Tony jumped from a cliff, and so therefore, as a result, his body must have been smashed to pieces, which is hardly the best bedside manner for a trained medical professional. It comes as no real surprise then when we later discover she is no more a trained nurse than I am, and is actually there to help her lover Simon in his bid to obtain the family money, all for himself. Simon returns home intoxicated, much to the disapproval of Aunt Harriet. The relationship between the two is incredibly tense, and it soon becomes clear that Aunt Harriet will do almost anything to protect the family name, something that we will also see in A Bell from Hell a little bit later. Simon is certainly more than happy to play on this. Reaching for yet another glass of brandy, he points out that Eleanor's fainting spell in the church would cause more gossip than anything he could do, and finishes off by saying, quote, "If you're so concerned about the Ashby family name, the best thing would be to have her certified as a lunatic," end quote. And so it seems as if we are venturing down familiar territory, a film in which the heroine is being gaslit in an attempt to drive her over the edge. This certainly seems to be the case when she sees Tony in the garden from her bedroom window, and rushing outside, comes face to face with the brother that she thought long dead. Needless to say, when Harriet and Simon come outside to find her, the mysterious figure has once again disappeared. This suspicion is amplified by the revelation in the next scene that Francois is not a nurse at all. She and Simon discuss Eleanor's mental state in her bedroom, with Francois stripping down to a slip in an effort to both seduce Simon and also to appeal to male viewers of the early 1960s. But it's also clear that their relationship is very one-sided, with Francois feeling far more for Simon than he does for her. This is sharply revealed by his abrupt dismissal with a kiss on the forehead, and also by the fact that he brazenly leaves the door open for Aunt Harriet to note the nature of their relationship. Clearly, in this house, Simon feels that he need answer to no one. We see more of this attitude in the next scene, and also the signs of what is clearly an incredibly violent, if not psychotic, temper. Outraged that Williams the butler cannot provide him with more brandy, Simon screams furiously in the man's face, descending into a psychotic rage as he smashes glasses and a decanter. The reason that there is no brandy soon becomes apparent as we next see Simon in the offices of Cosset, the family solicitor, played by a stalwart of British film and television, Maurice Denham. Simon, not unlike Alfred Tichborne, has been burning his way through his allowance, and we hear mention of gambling debts, yachts, and of course a very lengthy credit note at the local off-licence. We also learn that Simon and Eleanor are due to come into their inheritance in less than 3 weeks, putting rather a sense of urgency into his plans to get his sister out of the way. Not that this has gone unnoticed by Mr. Cosset, who accuses him of doing that very thing. To this, Simon in turn accuses the solicitor of embezzlement, saying that once he does come into his estate, the first thing he will do is have a financial audit conducted. This, though, is clearly just an empty threat. As Simon himself says just a few moments later, the solicitor is so honest that he would rather cut his own throat than break the law. Not so, though, his son Keith Cossett, to whom Simon addresses this last remark. Young Keith has indeed been helping himself to the family funds, and Simon knows this all too well, using the knowledge to blackmail him for £100, just to tide him over, of course. But what Simon cannot know, and nor do we at this point, is that Keith Cossett is not just an embezzler. He is also the person behind the supposed Tony's reappearance, and that the reason for this is to cover up Keith's own financial crimes. If Simon's plan is to rid himself of his sister, it very nearly comes to fruition, as in the next scene we see Eleanor standing on a cliff top. Or rather, we see her standing in front of a green screen of the cliff tops, which, if we're honest, really hasn't dated very well. Overcome with grief, neurosis, and whatever medication Simon and Francois have been providing her, Eleanor throws herself into the sea, but is rescued by the man that she saw in the church and the garden. Not a ghost at all, but incredibly real, and looking exactly like her dead brother Tony. But their return to the house gives us the first in a trail of clues that Tony is probably not who he later claims to be. Carrying the unconscious Eleanor inside, he is told that her room is still the same one that she had as a child, but it's clear when he goes upstairs that he isn't entirely sure which door he should open. Leaving the house, Tony is nearly run over by Simon in his sports car, who swerves to miss him and rams his car into an ornamental flower bed as a result. This leads to a fantastic moment where the two come face to face for the very first time, with Simon's shocked reaction making it quite apparent that whatever game the newcomer is playing, it isn't one of his invention. Half terrified, he jumps into his sports car and goes to drive away, but the two are summoned inside by Aunt Harriet and the interrogation of Tony begins. This scene is very well played, in particular by Sheila Burrell as Harriet and Alexander Davion as Tony, particularly when he politely informs her that the reason he ran away was because he couldn't stand being near her for another moment. Alexander Davion, who plays Tony, was a French-born British actor who began his career with a string of minor roles, including 1951's Captain Horatio Hornblower, Richard III in 1955, and Song Without End in 1960. Paranoiac was his first major film role, and though he did a handful of movies after this, including the horrors The Plague of the Zombies and Incense for the Damned, he really made his name, in Britain anyway, playing the lead role in a police procedural called Gideon's Way, which ran from 1964 to 1966. He's a good enough leading man in Paranoiac, delivering the right level of gravitas and showcasing his handsome good looks. But the problem with his character is that we never really learn that much about him. Even after it is revealed he is an imposter, we are given no clue as to his actual identity, where he has come from, why he so readily agreed to be part of Keith's plotting, or even his actual name. Despite Aunt Harriet and Simon's suspicions, Tony, or whatever his name is invited to stay at the house, and here we have another clue that he is not the long-lost brother he pretends to be. Following some very nice interplay between he and Simon, he is told that his bedroom is exactly as he left it, with Simon waiting at the bottom of the stairs to see if he heads in the right direction. When he arrives on the landing, it is clear that he is confused once again as to which door he should take, and this is something his fellow conspirator should probably have drilled into him a little bit harder. But in the end, he chooses the right option and settles into his lookalike's room for the evening. But if Keith Cossett didn't brief him properly on the location of Tony's room, he certainly briefed him on everything else. The next day, old Mr. Cossett arrives to test his identity, and there follows a question and answer session where Tony, of course, gets every answer right, though he does manage enough pretense to make the recollection seem genuine rather than rehearsed. Despite this, though, his answers are all a little too convenient for Aunt Harriet, who proclaims him an imposter, and they're also far too much for Simon, who storms out of the house to drown his sorrows at the local pub. Needless to say, you wouldn't get away with this these days, and Tony would have been sent straight for a DNA check before you can say Bob's your uncle, or indeed Harriet's your aunt. But then again, there is little from the golden age of detection that hasn't been ruined by scientific progress. One very good reason why adaptations of writers like Tay, or indeed Agatha Christie, work much better when set firmly in the past, in which they were written. At this point in the film, I was also reminded of a more recent movie that explored a similar notion, but this time a documentary, a 2012 film called The Imposter. This told the wildly improbable, but somehow true, story of a French conman called Frédéric Bourdin, who pretended to be Nicholas Barclay, an American who had disappeared in Texas at the age of just 13. As it turns out, Bourdin had a long record of impersonating children, which is quite remarkable, given that he was 23 years old at the time. He was also clearly very good at it, fooling the police in Spain and the US. He even managed to fool Nicholas Barclay's own family, though there is more than a hint that they may have had their own reasons for welcoming him so quickly back into their fold. I won't say any more for fear of spoiling it, but it's a very good film which was nominated for multiple awards and was even shortlisted for Best Documentary at the Oscars. So if you get the chance to track it down, I think you won't be disappointed. Back to Paranoiac then, and we now have the reveal of the actual plot, which Josephine Tey reveals at the outset of her novel, but Jimmy Sangster chose to reveal in the middle of the film. We see Tony and Keith meet in a local pub, where their roles in the conspiracy are clearly laid out. And what is also laid out is the beginning of a semi-incestuous subplot, as Keith warns Tony to watch his behaviour with Eleanor. Quote, "After all, she is meant to be your sister." End quote. Simon, meanwhile, is getting more and more drunk in the local pub, raging it up with the patrons and taking his aggression out on a homeless man whom he addresses as his brother. But as with the earlier decanter scene, his mood soon slips into violence, and in another very good performance of psychotic rage, he attacks one of the patrons with a handful of darts pulled from the dartboard. Ironically, it is imposter Tony who comes to bail him out of trouble. And driving back to the house, Simon decides to pay the imposter a very backhanded but highly perceptive compliment. Quote, "I don't know who found you or where, but you're Tony to a T, I'll give you that. Pompous, self-opinionated, holier than thou, and dull." End quote. So, not much brotherly love there then. As we've heard, Jimmy Sangster felt that, as a Hammer production, he had to include elements of horror. And though up to this point the film has been an engaging, if rather predictable thriller, it now shifts firmly into out-and-out gothic, if not proto-slasher territory. Disturbed by the sound of a church organ playing in the night, Tony creeps through the grounds until he finds an old chapel. Peering inside, he sees a robed figure sitting at a classical organ, which seems almost a homage to the Phantom of the Opera. More significantly, this robed figure is not alone. Peering through the doorway to get a closer look, Tony is attacked by a short figure wielding a billhook, dressed as a choir boy, their face obscured beneath an incredibly grotesque and memorable papier-mâché mask. This, along with the other effects in the movie, was created by Roy Ashton, who took over Hammer's special effects and makeup work from Phil Leakey when he left the studio shortly after The Curse of Frankenstein. As well as working for Hammer on films like The Mummy, The Curse of the Werewolf and The Devil Rides Out, Ashton also worked for Amicus on their anthology movies, including Tales from the Crypt and Asylum, and later he would go on to do makeup work on Ken Russell's The Devils, Star Wars, and also Raiders of the Lost Ark. His work here, particularly on the mask and later the rotting corpse of the real Tony, is very well done, particularly given the low budget, and the sudden appearance of the choir boy figure certainly adds a new dimension to the film. Tony is slashed on the arm, and it is now his turn to be rescued by Eleanor, as she too has heard the music and has come down to investigate herself. The next day, both Tony and Eleanor are nearly killed in a car accident orchestrated by Simon, who has tampered with the brakes of Eleanor's car and nearly sends the two of them over the edge of another green screen cliff. When they return home, shaken but unscathed, we see Simon weep with frustrated rage, and Nurse Francoise finally begins to understand that Simon might be good-looking and about to inherit a fortune, but he is also clearly incredibly unwell. That night we return once again to the chapel, and we see that the figure playing the organ is Simon, once again accompanied by his masked chorister friend. But this time Tony, accompanied by Eleanor, has set a trap, and the choir boy is revealed to be none other than Aunt Harriet. And here she tells Tony and Eleanor what the viewer has pretty much suspected all along, that it is not Eleanor but Simon who is the insane one in the family. Quote, "I suppose it was inevitable you should find out eventually. God knows I did my best to prevent it. You should have taken the warning the first time. I only wanted to keep you away from the chapel while Simon was there. Your brother's mad. He's insane. He felt responsible for Tony's death. For weeks, for months, he'd been normal. This ghastly impersonation I have to do. It's only by pretending his brother is alive that he finds some peace." End quote. Sadly for her, their conversation is overheard by Francoise, who decides that she has had enough and that it's time for her to leave. Meanwhile, Tony and Eleanor, realizing that Simon must have tampered with the brakes on Eleanor's car, find themselves in a passionate embrace and even kiss. Rather understandably, Eleanor freaks out more than a little at the idea that she has fallen in love with her brother, and declaring herself insane and dirty, attempts to take her own life. This forces the imposter Tony to finally admit the truth, a truth which spares her from the horrifying thought of incest, but which should surely also present a couple of issues of its own. After all, it now turns out that the brother she thought had returned is not her brother at all, but is instead a lookalike conman. Rather illogically, though, this doesn't seem to cause even the slightest wrinkle in their relationship, and even more ridiculously, she still continues to call him Tony even after the truth is revealed. Finally, having had enough of the Ashby family, and who can blame her, Nurse Francoise attempts to leave, but is stopped, seduced, and then murdered by Simon, leading to a very effective moment where we see his face from underneath the water as he drowns her in the pond. It is possible that part of this sequence was edited by the censor. Apparently, 11 seconds of the film were cut before it was released. But there has been some speculation that the scenes removed hinted at an incestuous relationship between Simon and Aunt Harriet, with at least one observer noticing a clumsy jump cut in one of their exchanges. Nevertheless, this murder is a very effective moment, showcasing both Francis and cinematographer Arthur Grant's eye for an arresting image. Given the cold-blooded murder of Francois, it comes as no surprise to discover at the climax of the film that the real Tony didn't in fact throw himself off the cliffs all those years ago, but was instead murdered by Simon, who then hid his body in the chapel where he now plays the organ every night. Certainly, it comes as no real surprise to imposter Tony, who breaks into the chapel to reveal the desiccated and mummified corpse. Another piece of very effective work by Roy Ashton that was apparently just as impactful off-screen as it was on. Apparently one night he left the corpse in the chair of his makeup studio, leading him to be greeted the next morning by a cleaner who was frankly terrified. We now have a climactic fight and a rather typical fiery finale. Aunt Harriet, who clearly knew the truth all along, sets fire to the chapel and the house in an attempt to hide the evidence and save the family's good name, which is all very reminiscent of Mrs. Danvers in Rebecca. Needless to say, Simon perishes in the fire, but our two lovebirds, no longer plagued by the shadow of incest, survive and live to love another day. Paranoiac was first released in the States as a single feature in May 1963, and then in the UK as part of a double bill with Hammer's The Kiss of the Vampire in January 1964. Reviews were rather mixed, which is perhaps not surprising given its provenance, but most were very complimentary about Oliver Reed, who, as I said earlier, pretty much carries the film. Variety noted that he played his role with demonic skill, and the New York Mirror wrote, quote, "He plays one of the worst heels ever put up on screen, more sadistic than Bill Sikes or Jekyll's Hyde," end quote. And this last review seems rather prophetic, because in fact Reed would go on to play both characters, Bill Sikes in Oliver in 1968, and Mr. Hyde, or more accurately Mr. Hype, in the 1980 comedy Dr. Heckle and Mr. Hype. I've never seen that one, and to be honest, it sounds absolutely bloody terrible. Elsewhere, the New York Times wrote that Hammer had come tantalizingly close to the bullseye, adding, quote, "This economical little chiller has some solid assets. It opens with devilish adroitness and whips up considerable suspense and conviction with some sparse, succinct dialogue," end quote. Cinematograph Weekly wrote that there was more acting ability than usual in this type of film, and the New York Herald Tribune called it idiotically entertaining, though it qualified this by adding, quote, "Provided, of course, that you find entertainment in blood, gore, and lunacy," end quote. Of Hammer's thrillers, Paranoiac is often called the second best after A Taste of Fear, and admittedly, that earlier film is better plotted. But for me, this film is heightened by the quite stunning cinematography, green screen aside, and some very good performances. Janette Scott is very good as the fragile Eleanor. Sheila Burrell is suitably domineering and quite possibly deranged as Aunt Harriet. And Alexander Davion, as I mentioned, is a perfectly fine leading man, even if his part is rather underwritten. There is also, of course, the hook-wielding, mask-wearing choir boy, an image that deserves to go down in Hammer iconography, along with Dracula, Frankenstein's monster, and the Mummy. But, of course, the film really belongs completely to Oliver Reed, and it serves as a testament to his immense talent. A talent that sadly was so often overshadowed by his wild man image and his incredibly dark and troubling personal life. After Paranoiac, Freddie Francis directed 4 more horrors for Hammer: The Evil of Frankenstein and Nightmare, both in 1964, Hysteria in 1965, and Dracula Has Risen from the Grave in 1968. He also directed for the studio's rivals Amicus, including the anthologies Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, Torture Garden, and Tales from the Crypt, and their less successful full-length features The Skull, The Psychopath, and The Deadly Bees. Other films include the brilliantly bonkers Mumsy, Nanny, Sunny and Girly in 1970, which was originally going to be the first half of this week's double bill. It's absolutely insane, and as of the time of recording, it's available to watch on YouTube, and I have no doubt I will be returning to it to cover at some point later in the series. There was also a 1975 pairing of The Ghoul and Legend of the Werewolf for Tyburn Films, and the much-derided but highly enjoyable anthology Tales That Witness Madness in 1973. This one gets quite a bad rap from many horror experts, but I quite like it. As I think I've said before, any film that has Joan Collins in a love triangle with her husband and a living tree really can't be all bad. He also directed Joan Crawford's final movie, Trog, in 1970, which saw her as a scientist who discovers a primitive troglodyte living in a cave, which I can't really say much in defence of, though I do know some people who really like it. Sadly, as you can tell from that little list, Freddie Francis found himself rather typecast as a director of horror films, and he never really got to move very far into other genres. His final film as a director was The Doctor and the Devils, released in 1985, about the grave robbers Burke and Hare. But even before then, he had made the decision to return to cinematography, at which he was arguably far better than he was a director. His films in this capacity include The Elephant Man in 1980, The French Lieutenant's Woman in 1981, June in 1984, Glory in 1989, and Cape Fear in 1991. Glory won him his second Oscar, and his final film as cinematographer was The Straight Story, directed by David Lynch, which was released in 1999. The recipient of Lifetime Achievement Awards from the British Society of Cinematographers, Empire magazine and the Evening Standard British Film Awards, to name just a few, Freddie Francis died at the age of 89 on the 17th of March, 2007. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is A Bell from Hell from 1973. This stars Renaud Verley, Christina von Blanc, Viveca Lindfors and Maribel Martín, and was directed by Claudio Guerín Hill, known commonly as Claudio Guerín. And I use the term directed there advisedly. Technically, the film was largely directed by Guerín, but it was then completed by Juan Antonio Bardem, after Guerín tragically died in an accident on set on the last day of filming. If you've seen the film, you will know that the church, which forms part of the climax, has two bell towers. One of these was constructed specifically for the film, running parallel to the existing tower and, as we see in the movie, surrounded by scaffolding. On the final day of filming, Guerín attempted to jump from this scaffolding to an overhang on the church, but he lost his balance and fell 20 metres or 65 feet, dying on his way to the hospital. This certainly gives the film a tragic and macabre backstory. However, some have taken this a step further and have suggested that the movie is somehow cursed. In the main, they have latched onto a legend associated with the filming location, the real church of San Martino de Noia in Galicia, Spain. And I'm going to read that legend to you now from the church's website. Quote, "Popular culture holds that a curse hangs over the unfinished tower of this church. Anyone who attempts to complete the second tower will meet a tragic end. Legend has it that an old master stonemason fell from it while working." End quote. Personally, I don't believe in cursed movies, but I do believe in coincidences and confirmation bias. Guerín death was a tragic accident, made all the worse by the fact that spectators, who had gathered to watch the filming, initially thought it was a stunt for the movie and burst into applause. Terrible? Absolutely. But a curse? Absolutely not. Nor, in my opinion, is Poltergeist cursed, or The Omen, or The Exorcist, or any other number of films that have had this label attached to them, either as a marketing device or as an urban legend. To quote the Exorcist writer William Peter Blatty, quote, "For God's sake, if you shoot something for a year, people are going to get hurt, people are going to die. These things happen." End quote. Of course, Guerín didn't take a year to film A Bell from Hell, and the shoot only lasted 6 weeks, but accidents happen all the time. In my opinion, to try to attribute these to supposed mystical forces diminishes the actual event and also overshadows the real tragedy, which in this case is the loss of a considerable talent who was only 34 years old. He was born in 1939 in Seville, in Spain, though his family moved to a village on the outskirts of Seville when he was 8 years old, and it was here that he went to school. Interested in creative media from a very young age, he initially began working in radio in his late teens, specifically at the fledgling local radio station. He maintained this interest when he returned to Seville in 1958, joining Radio Vida, where he learned about audio production and also began to become involved with film criticism. Importantly, he also became involved with Cine Club Vida, a film club affiliated to the station that exposed him to a world of cinema not shown to the majority of the Spanish cinema-going public. In 1961, he moved to Madrid to study at the prestigious film school, and he also began writing for film magazines. A friend of his from the period recalled him to be, quote, "an outstanding student," which didn't prevent him from receiving the occasional failing grade from lecturers, with whom he debated his theories and points of view on cinema. But all those who studied with him have fond memories of him. Of that we are certain. End quote. His 1964 graduation film was a black and white short called Luciano, which won widespread acclaim when it was initially screened. Even then, though, the same childhood friend recalled that he made things difficult for himself, noting, quote, "He lacked the time and money to finish it within the school's deadlines, so he had to use his own money to complete it to his satisfaction. He was a meticulous man, and he liked his work done well." End quote. Not only was he a meticulous man, but if Luciano is anything to go by, he was also ahead of his time. This 30-minute film tells the story of the murder of a young boy committed by the titular Luciano, a teacher in a Catholic school. The subject matter was certainly controversial for Francoist Spain, but what is just as interesting is the way in which the story is presented, combining mockumentary, true crime and flashbacks to build a montage of the events leading up to and after the murder. It also anticipates some of the themes that we see in A Bell from Hell, though, as we will discover shortly, much of these were the creation of the writer Santiago Moncada. Luciano was very well received by Guérin's professors and, more importantly, by critics of the time. Its success led to him being hired by Televisión Española, which had an agreement with the film school that graduates would be provided with jobs. We've talked about this project before in previous episodes, and it was very much seen as a way to modernize the image of Francoist Spain and bring new approaches to television entertainment as the country opened up to tourism. Here, he worked across all genres, from dramas to documentaries, developing a highly individualized style that was favorably compared to experimental filmmaking, and which essentially revolutionized Spanish popular television. In 1969, he contributed a segment for an anthology movie called The Challenges, which tells 3 stories about how everyday situations can explode into aggression and violence. He followed this with his first feature, a Spanish-Italian co-production called The House of the Doves. This was released in 1972 and was a drama about a mother and daughter who find their lives disrupted when the mother's former love appears back in their lives. As well as being Guérin's first feature film, it would also serve as his first significant issue with the Spanish censors and would prove to be a rather bitter experience. We've discussed the challenges posed by the Spanish censorship board in several episodes now, particularly episode 1 and episode 50. As a result of these, it had at the time become fairly common to shoot 2 versions when making a movie, one for release overseas, which would be very much left alone by the censor, and the other for release in Spain, which would more heavily yield to the Catholic censor's tastes. But on The House of the Doves, Guérin refused to do this, shooting only one version, and this quite naturally fell foul of the censor's scissors. He was so annoyed by the changes to his work that he disowned this version of the film altogether. Similar issues befell his next project, a television special for TVE, which used the mockumentary style he had employed in Luciano to follow the recent Eurovision winner, Maciel, and her return home to Spain. This had 10 minutes cut by the censor, and Guérin was once again understandably angry, once again dismissing the new version of the film and saying that he would like to have his name removed from the credits. At around this time, he was approached by a film company called Hesperia Films to direct a project for them, a horror film from a screenplay written by Santiago Moncada. At this stage, the golden age of Spanish horror was at its height, and many so-called reputable directors had begun exploiting the genre. Perhaps inspired by this, Guérin accepted, and it was decided that his next film would be a horror movie called A Bell from Hell, and that he would this time make 2 versions, one for overseas and the other for domestic Spanish cinemas. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so all warnings apply from here on in. On hearing of the project, his friends tried to talk him out of it, thinking it would be disastrous for his career. But although it was a far more commercial proposition than they might have expected him to take on, he had accepted it as part of a much wider strategy, which was to establish himself professionally within the feature film industry. More importantly, following his issues with the censor, he wanted to make a screenplay that had already been approved by the board, and so he decided to stick to that signed-off screenplay as closely as possible. Writer Santiago Moncada is a man we have mentioned before. Not only did he write the screenplay for this film, but he also wrote the screenplays for Mario Bava's A Hatchet for the Honeymoon from 1970 and The Corruption of Chris Miller, which we discussed all the way back in episode 12. But he was far more than just a screenwriter for Euro cult cinema. He was a prize-winning novelist and dramatist long before he moved into writing screenplays, and this is something that he also continues successfully long after. Nevertheless, he has been called one of the most distinctive voices in Spanish horror. His works often focus on people tormented by the past or by rigid social structures like the family, which happens both in The Corruption of Chris Miller and in this week's film, A Bell from Hell. The film came at a very prolific stage in Moncada's career. By this point, he had become so adept at writing genre movies that he was producing multiple screenplays every year. Regardless, he has said of this one in particular that it was, quote, the first screenplay I conceived without thinking about fashionable actors or actresses, or about how it might eventually perform at the box office. I confess that I enjoyed writing it. End quote. The screenplay, which combines gothic themes of family secrets, fog-shrouded castles and insanity, references the works of Edgar Allan Poe and the English Edwardian writer Saki, and was originally called I'll Kill You at 3, or alternatively, The Bastard. But both of these titles, along with the full screenplay, were rejected by the Censor's Office when it was first submitted, who were concerned that the script justified violence, that it showed sexual perversion like fetishism, and also that it included lewd, brutal, and violent images. Needless to say then, several cuts had to be made before it was approved on its second submission. But even though the censors passed it at that stage, they still noted that it was over-complex, and also rather dismissively referred to it as, quote, one of those films that people call horror, end quote. As we've discussed in previous episodes, many, but not all, Spanish horrors of the time can often be seen as allegorical for the state of the country under Franco, and A Bell from Hell is no exception. Although Guerín once said that he wasn't interested in films with messages, and it's not as politically explicit as some of his contemporaries, somewhere between his direction and Moncada's screenplay, social political messaging appears rather front and centre throughout the film. The themes explored include the tension between the older Spain and the modern country that was beginning to appear, the corrupt nature of the bourgeoisie, repression, control, and rebellion. And even if you don't notice these across the course of the narrative, though they are rather hard to miss, it's all nicely summed up by a sermon given by the local priest towards the end of the film. Quote, in these times where we hear fallacious voices all around, when people speak of sexual freedom and revolutions, we only wish to hear ever louder the voice of the Supreme Creator. End quote. The film opens with our protagonist, Juan, who is incarcerated in a psychiatric clinic, though we do not actually know this at the time. In fact, he could also be in some form of prison. But although we open with him, we do not see his face. He is preparing a rubber solution to create a mask of himself, for reasons which are revealed a little later. We therefore see him at first with this rubber gloop on his face, quite literally faceless, before he pulls it away to reveal a young man who has a very good line in Smouldering, but more importantly, clearly also a very good line in Determination. Juan collects his personal possessions, which include a watch, some money, and a pair of old family photographs, one of which he rips in two, but the other, a photograph of 4 children playing near a tree, he puts within his pocket. He then meets Dr. Conquero, the head of the facility and a person we later discover has been conspiring with Juan's family to keep him institutionalized, and also may well have been dosing him with some serious psychedelic drugs. During their exchange, we learn that Juan is due to stand trial for something in the next 2 months. We also discover that his release is part of a test, that it is being done in agreement with his Aunt Marta, and that it is on condition that he reports back every 8 days. Giving Juan the summons, Dr. Conquero discharges him from the clinic, and after Juan leaves, refusing to shake his hand, the doctor then picks up the phone and calls somebody, who we presume to be Aunt Marta. And so from these moments, all pre-credits, we gain a lot of information about our protagonist. As well as everything that is said, we also infer that he is an accomplished artist, that with his long hair and motorbike he is deeply rebellious, and that there is no small amount of conflict between he and the establishment. As Juan rides through the countryside beneath the opening credits, he is passed by and then passes a large church bell being transported on the back of a truck. As those who have seen the film already will know, this bell plays a rather ominous role in Juan's latest story, and on second viewing, its continual appearance over the first third of the film, ever nearing its destination, makes it feel like death is stalking him from the very second that he leaves the confines of the clinic. He stops along the way by the tree which was the setting for the one family photograph that he has kept, a black and white image of 4 children playing, who we later learn are Juan and his 3 cousins. We also hear the sound of children singing, not in diegetic sound but in Juan's imagination, a song from his past childhood that becomes a melodic motif for the film. It was originally to have been the Spanish children's song, At 3 I'll Kill You Again, hence the original title, but when the title was changed, so was the melody. But at the very least, the ding-dang-dong of the refrain of the song suits the title and the climax of the film perfectly. From here we have a rather strange sequence, as we are introduced to the character of the shepherd and his granddaughter, who appear among the trees as Juan is exploring more remnants of childhood, a broken doll and a broken hobby horse that he has found in an abandoned and crumbling outbuilding. Blending in with the nearby trees, the shepherd seems more part of the land than he does human being, and he also has a rather oblique message. This initially appears to be a warning, but on second viewing it becomes clear that this is actually more of an update on work he has been carrying out on Juan's behalf, as well as a small amount of character judgment on Juan's morality. Quote, "The wild fig trees have already been pulled from the graves. The toad's blood and the bone pulled from the mouth of a dog in heat await. The dead will be resurrected. The night owl sang 3 times, while your parents copulated in secret to conceive you." End quote. Like I say, all rather opaque. At first watch, anyway. This scene is shot and edited in a very experimental way, and it does sit at odds with the rest of the film. The reason for this is that, following Guérin's death, they had very little footage to work with, and so rather than filming more, which on reflection they probably should have done, they opted to try and edit around what they had. For the first-time viewer, this scene might seem somewhat off-putting, as you might believe you stumbled onto a surrealist art house film. But while the film does retain some very surreal touches, particularly with its visuals and Juan's house full of animals, the dialogue at least does become far more coherent than it appears here. Juan returns to the family home, which has clearly seen better days but still gives an indication of his wealth. We follow him through the house, revealing a grey and decaying interior that he will soon transform with vivid colours, silver screens, branches hanging from the ceiling, and a menagerie of animals. Before this, though, we observe him sitting mournfully and flicking through a photo album, accompanied by the song Frère Jacques. We now come to a painfully long sequence set within a real slaughterhouse, where Juan is learning to stun, kill, and skin the animals. It goes on for an unfortunately long time, and is far more explicit than similar scenes in 1972's The Cannibal Man, and needless to say, it's quite hard to get through. But after what seems like an eternity, we then see Juan resigning from the role, saying rather ominously that he has now learned all that he needs to know. He continues his inspection of his home, finding a set of beehives destroyed and the bees dying, something that he will replace for a brilliantly vengeful scene later in the film. He also meets his former love, who is now married to a town elder called Don Pedro, and then goes to visit his family, who live in what can only be described as a Gothic castle overlooking the sea and surrounded by mist. While waiting for his Aunt Marta to make him tea, Juan snoops through the house and finds financial evidence that his aunt was paying not just the clinic for his stay, but was also sending money to Dr. Conquero directly. He steals a document with which to forge her signature and then demonstrates his macabre sense of humour as he plays a very mean practical joke on a surveyor who has called in on Aunt Marta for business purposes. He tells the surveyor that it is the anniversary of a great family tragedy when his aunt lost all her daughters after they drowned on a fishing trip. He says that the experience drove her mad and that she now believes they will return home for tea each evening, expecting them to come through the doorway singing as they had done in real life. The surveyor is understandably concerned then when Aunt Marta enters and tells him that he must excuse the door being open, but she is waiting for her daughters to come home from a fishing trip. This initially pushes us into the world of the ghost story, and the scene is a brilliantly edited series of close-ups of the anxious surveyor intercut with shots of the ominous, mist-shrouded open door. And sure enough, eventually we hear the sound of women singing, and 3 silhouettes appear from the mist and begin to make their way inside. The surveyor flees in an understandable panic, and at that point we see that these are not spirit figures at all, but are in fact real people of flesh and blood. And so we realise that Juan told the story on the spur of the moment, knowing that his cousins would soon return, and using them as the punchline in a ghost story to terrorise a perfectly innocent man. It's indicative of Juan's macabre character, and it is a very well-judged moment. But the scene itself doesn't really belong to either screenwriter Moncada or director Guerín. It was instead lifted, with 1 or 2 minor variations, from an Edwardian story called The Open Window by a writer called Hector Hugh Munro, who wrote under the pen name of Saki. I've mentioned him before in our folk horror episode because of his stories The Music on the Hill and Sredni Vashtar, and if you've never encountered his work, you might want to take a look. Frequently populated with appalling characters getting their comeuppance, his stories are incredibly dry, malicious and sarcastic. But be warned, some of them are also rather of their time, so if you decide to check them out, it's best to approach them with that in mind. And so we now meet Juan's cousins, Maria, with whom he was once in love and had a relationship, Teresa, who has falsely accused him of rape, and Esther, who had no past relationship with him, but makes it quite clear that she would like one. It's a very twisted sexual dynamic between first cousins, and one can only imagine what the Tichborne family would have made of it, but it forms a strange sexual subtext across the remainder of the film. Given the sexual chemistry and sexual frustration happening right in front of her eyes, one would have imagined that Aunt Marta might have wanted to keep Juan as far away as possible, but to the contrary, she wants to keep him near. What she really wants, of course, is control. It also becomes clear as the story progresses that she's not been above using her daughters as a way of gaining this. In addition, we start to realise that Juan's stay in the asylum was not for his own good, but for hers, hence the additional payments to the doctor, and that the 3 cousins have also, to a greater or lesser extent, also been responsible for his incarceration. Aunt Marta then represents the establishment, the bourgeoisie, and the old guard, a controlling figure who is horrified by Juan's youthful rebellion, later announcing that young people must have a strong hand to guide them, even against their will if necessary. She also has a male counterpart in the character of Don Pedro, a seemingly respectable figure who is a pederast and a rapist, and who we meet properly the following day. Before we meet him, the next day one visits the parish priest, as the church bell, which has been making its way by truck and ox-pulled wagon, finally arrives in the town square. The priest tells Juan that he has been praying for him, and we learn that he was a very supportive figure to Juan's mother. He also has a very clear understanding of the people who populate the village, saying that the greatest enemies of the church are false Catholics, to which Juan replies, and false madmen, and false wise men, and all that is false, laying the film's agenda out pretty clearly. And we meet 4 of these false Catholics properly now, as Don Pedro and his hunting buddies are shown going on an excursion. Before they do this, though, these pillars of the establishment take the opportunity to bully and harass the shepherd's granddaughter, frightening her to such an extent that she tries to escape in a rowing boat. Knowing that she has no oars, the men push the boat into the lake and watch her from the bank for hours. Eventually, Don Pedro, appearing to be a genuine voice of concern, throws her a rope and encourages her to pull herself into the bank. When she does, however, his concern soon disappears and he tries to assault her. Fortunately, Juan has been visiting Don Pedro's wife, who was once his old flame. Once again demonstrating a love of macabre jokes, he tricks her into thinking he has pulled his own eyes out, causing her to faint dead away. After carrying her inside unconscious, he leaves, albeit after rearranging her clothes and leaving a note in a way that would lead her to assume that he has assaulted her, though he actually does no such thing. This scene was one to which the censors originally objected, but not for the reasons you might think. The implication of sexual assault was apparently fine with them, but in the original screenplay, Juan didn't pluck out his eyes, but instead chopped off a fake arm. They thought this far too grisly and agreed to the change to eye gouging, which arguably ended up being far more disturbing on screen than what was originally planned. And so, now travelling home, Juan finds Don Pedro and his cronies attacking the young girl, and at first terrorizes them with his motorbike before grabbing the girl and carrying her to safety. Not that he escapes without incident. He is knocked from his bike at one point, which he uses to his advantage the very next day. Appearing in a full upper body cast, he persuades an embarrassed and guilt-ridden Don Pedro that he needs help to urinate in the local bar toilets. Tricking the older man into holding his dick while he pees, he then reveals that the cast was all fake, much to Don Pedro's humiliation. But given that Don Pedro has by this point referred to the attempted rape as just a little bit of fun, and that, as they've now bought the girl a new dress, it should all be forgotten, it's fair to say he's getting off fairly lightly. The bell is finally raised to the top of the tower, its ascent pretty much marking the midpoint of the movie. We now see Juan on a cliff top digging 4 graves. 4 trees are waiting to go on top of each body, suddenly making sense of the shepherd's earlier proclamation that, quote, "the wild fig trees have already been pulled from the graves." End quote. By this point, we have gathered that Juan is plotting an elaborate revenge. We have already seen him preparing the cellar of his home by setting it up as a slaughterhouse, complete with mechanized hooks, pulleys and winches. We've also seen him take delivery of the item on which he was working at the start of the film, a life-size dummy replica of himself, which sits in a coffin-shaped crate in the corner of the basement. He's also been hiding cables and masking tape in various parts of the house, stashing them in convenient places and effectively setting up traps. We may not have all of the pieces together just yet, but it's quite clear that he is planning something fairly spectacular. And all starts to become clearer when, the next day, his Aunt Marta and his cousins arrive for a lunch date. And here we finally receive the missing background information as to the family story, and also yet more evidence that the film is about the old values versus the new, and about conformity versus rebellion. By this stage, Juan's house is a menagerie, complete with fish, small birds, a monkey, and a raven, leading to an incredibly surreal dinner party scene, all to Aunt Marta's great disapproval. Once again, the voice of the establishment, she tells him that his youth does not excuse his vulgarity, and that his tricks do not impress her, not even when he reveals that he knows she was paying the doctor at the clinic for special treatments. As to the reason why, it is of course partly to gain access to his money for herself, but also significantly because she is violently opposed to his former lifestyle. We discover that after his mother's death, Juan ran away to London, but he was underage and did so without his aunt's consent. Concerned about potential damage to the family reputation, and also by the prospect of his burning through his inheritance, Aunt Marta has him forcibly brought back home. After dinner, he accuses her of thinking that anyone not like her is going to hell, to which she appears to smugly agree, and she then voices her horror at his reported behaviour in Europe. Free love, drugs, sex, all a dreadful thing for the family name. This, of course, is not so different to Aunt Harriet from earlier on, but while she brushed things under the carpet, Aunt Marta took a far more pragmatic approach and had Juan committed under false charges of rape. "The punishment you gave me was severe," he tells her. "They destroyed me. You threw me to the lawyers, you threw me to the psychiatrists, and they ate me up." Rather sadly, he begs her for his freedom, saying that he will give up the family money and never return if only she will give him back his passport. It seems a simple enough request, and more advantageous to Aunt Marta than not, but despite the cousins feeling otherwise, she refuses. "If something bad happens to him, then what?" she asks. "We'd be blamed. Everything must be done legally. Whatever the judge and the doctors decide will be fair." She ends this by looking at Juan and saying, very patronisingly, that she just wants to protect him. And if that isn't the voice of a nanny state, then I don't know what is. This, however, turns out not to be the smartest decision on Aunt Marta's part, as she has effectively refused the get-out-of-jail-free card that Juan was offering her. And so, for the rest of the movie, Juan carries out his revenge on each of them, working on the assumption that if none of them are there to corroborate the false charges of rape, he can't possibly be convicted at his hearing. First, he takes the wheelchair-bound Aunt Marta to visit his new beehives, having drugged the coffee he gave her at lunch. He sprays her face with a perfume to attract the bees, then agitates the hives and leaves her to their mercy. Knowing that she has a weak heart, he assumes, quite reasonably, that this will probably finish her off. Returning to the house, he captures each of the sisters, beginning with a very long subjective camera shot as he runs from the beehives to meet his younger cousin Esther on the terrace. The two have a flirtation, and when he attempts to tie her up, she initially complies, thinking it's some form of joke. Too late, she discovers that it really isn't. Maria, with whom he has been in love, is next, and here she learns that his years in the institution have changed him, and that he no longer has love for her in his heart, only hatred. He also tells her that there is no difference between right and wrong, only rules, before violently hitting her multiple times. It's quite a tough watch, but a tougher one is to follow, as having now captured Esther and Maria, he comes to eldest sister Teresa. Here it is revealed that she did indeed lie about his attempt to rape her, which was part of the family plan to have him locked away. Telling her that she may well have had her plans, but he has now designed his own, he sexually assaults her and then knocks her unconscious. Taking the unconscious and trussed-up sisters down to the cellar, Juan strings them up using the slaughterhouse apparatus we earlier saw him install. Treating them much as the animals we saw in the earlier slaughterhouse sequence, we see him hoist them up on winches and begin to run them through a water shower. And just in case we hadn't gotten the analogy, we also have some intercuts of the earlier slaughterhouse scene, just to make sure it's fully understood. After death, what happens to the skin? Juan asks the three sisters. What happens to the eyes? What happens to the hair? Everything rots and disappears. You will become resin. You'll climb the trunks of the pines in the spring. After a few years, I will return to the cliff and think those leaves could be Teresa's fingers, the other ones her cheeks. You'll always be facing the sea. The wind will caress you for centuries. All very Edgar Allan Poe, and there's far more to come later. But although for a second it looks as if he is about to cut Maria's throat, he seems unable to actually go through with it. He decides instead to answer a sudden ring at the doorbell, which on reflection is probably not the wisest thing to do when attempting to carry out multiple murder, and as a result leaves the girls alone in the basement. It is his former lover, Mrs. Don Pedro, at the door, and the two have a brief conversation, after which Juan doesn't return to the basement, but instead to the beehives to see what has happened to Aunt Marta. But her wheelchair is empty and her cape lies on the ground, and as rain lashes down from the heavens, he begins a frantic search to try to find her. Sure enough, he does, as she attacks him with her walking stick, her face puffy from bee venom. And just as it looks as if he is about to finally overpower her, Don Pedro arrives and hits Juan around the head with a shovel. We now have another Poe reference as we cut to Don Pedro walling Juan in at the foot of the church bell tower, which recalls the stories The Cask of Amontillado and The Black Cat. As his aunt and cousins watch, Don Pedro explains that tied around Juan's neck is a rope for the new bell in the tower. When the bells are rung to celebrate their installation the next morning, Juan's body will act as the counterweight and he will be hanged and killed. It is incredibly dark and also, of course, incredibly gothic, and for a while we assume that Juan must be able to find some way out of this predicament. Throughout the film, we have seen that he has been a master of electronics, an impressive artist, and a visual effects man, and so we wrongly assume that he will be able to MacGyver himself in some way out of trouble. But no. The next day, as the family gather for the mass to celebrate the bells, the plan is fully carried out. At first, the weight is too much for the choir boys assigned to the task, and so Don Pedro and his little group of cronies spring into action, pulling at the rope with all of their might and ensuring that Juan is now dead. All this, by the way, while the priest preaches about the dangers of immorality and the horrors of sexual freedom. But, as we soon discover, Juan still has one very elaborate practical joke left up his sleeve. A Bell from Hell is a revenge-driven psychological gothic thriller with moments of very dark comedy, such as the joke on the surveyor or the stunt with the fake eye gouging. It's also, as I have mentioned, a fairly obvious critique on the establishment, represented by Aunt Marta, Don Pedro, and Dr. Conquero, all of whom are hypocritical, self-serving, corrupt, and criminal. This is not to say, though, that Juan is painted as an innocent hero in all of this. His sanity is questionable, to say the least, for the entire film, and while his aunt and cousins are indeed terrible people, his actions in retaliation are deeply uncomfortable to watch. The implication is that oppression has made him into a genuine monster. And being blunt, if Aunt Marta had just given him his freedom and his passport, then none of the violence would have happened in the first place. The film was, of course, very much overshadowed by the death of its director on the final day of shooting. And although this was an accident, there has been some speculation over the years that he might have taken his own life. Rumours which further added to the dark legends surrounding the production. It was first screened at the San Sebastian International Film Festival in 1973, and the presentation ultimately served as a tribute to the late filmmaker and a talent taken far too soon. Because for all of its B-movie origins, A Bell from Hell is a very good film. Beautifully photographed by cinematographer Manuel Rojas, it is impressively composed and beautifully lit, with fog-shrouded castles, thunderstorms and more adding to a very gothic atmosphere. The performances, particularly from French actor Renaud Verley as Juan and veteran actress Viveca Lindfors as Aunt Marta, are very good, and there's also a small role for the actress Maribel Martín as Cousin Esther, and we'll be seeing her again in just a few weeks' time. Sadly, though, it didn't really do that well on its cinema release, disappearing almost as quickly as it arrived, and for many years it seemed to vanish into the ether, occasionally resurfacing on late-night Spanish TV and also eventually on VHS. Over time, however, it began to be reassessed as one of the key Spanish horrors of the 1970s. But perhaps inevitably, as the film's reputation grew, so too did the myths and legends surrounding the tragedy on its set. As discussed earlier, it is now often mentioned in documentaries and on social media as an example of supposedly cursed cinema. And sadly, another incident was pulled into this nonsense as recently as 2018. In that year, a filmmaker called Jesus Ponce was making a documentary about Claudio Guerín Hill and about A Bell from Hell. As part of the documentary, he travelled to the film shooting location, where he set up a screen in the village square, projecting the film exactly where it had been shot and exactly where Guerín had died. The very next day, writer Santiago Moncada died unexpectedly, and Ponce, who had been planning to interview him for his documentary, was now no longer able to. Some have suggested that this was an example of the curse in action, and that the screening of the film in the village square somehow triggered this event. Personally, I would say that at this stage Moncada was 90 years old, and I'm not entirely sure we can call any death at that age entirely unexpected. In any case, though, it fed into the legends, and people still talk about them to this very day. Both Paranoiac and A Bell from Hell centre on family reunions, prodigal children returning home to expose hypocrisy, repression and madness. Both feature domineering matriarchs prepared to do almost anything to protect the family name, and both share gothic themes of gaslighting, mental instability and actual or threatened confinement. Put together as a double bill, they provide a caustic commentary on the establishment and traditional respectable values, suggesting that while blood may indeed be thicker than water, the family unit is often where our greatest enemies are hiding in plain sight. So, as I mentioned at the top of the show, there isn't an episode next week, but I will be back on September the 6th with a double bill of Psycho Killers and a return to the Italian giallo and the 1980s. First up, we have Tenebrae from 1982 and director Dario Argento. This stars Anthony Franciosa, Daria Nicolodi, John Saxon and Giuliano Gemma. Then we follow this with White of the Eye from 1987 and director Donald Cammell. This stars David Keith, Kathy Moriarty, Art Evans and Alan Rosenberg. If you've enjoyed this episode, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please also consider sharing it with any horror-loving friends. As always, you can write to the show at thehorrordouble@gmail.com, and you can also follow our Instagram at thehorrordouble. So I'll be back on Sunday the 6th of September for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great couple of weeks. Goodbye.